It only lasts for like 2 seconds in Colorado. And then we get things that come out of the sky and beat you to death.
We actually get right here.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. I hope if you're nursing a hangover after July 4th revelry, I hope you're doing okay. I hope your head isn't still throbbing or whatever. But certainly in Aberdeen it was still raining, Aberdeen, North Carolina, and that clip I played you is actually a clip from Shan'ann's a video that she posted on Facebook, and she kind of had the kids sort of running out in the rain and sort of filming them, and quite a sort of sweet moment. So it was raining quite a lot at this time of the year 2 years ago. I don't know whether it is right now. Maybe folks in the area can let us know. On July 4th, Nicole Kessinger went to a Rockies game, baseball game without him. This must have stung enough to make an impression, because Watts used the idea of going to a Rockies game alone or with a work colleague as his alibi to Shan'ann on Saturday night, August 12th. So that whole incident where she went to the Rockies game without him certainly stayed with him. He probably also felt quite insecure about that. Maybe he didn't. But what is interesting, I don't get the impression that Kessinger sort of necessarily did that to spite him. I think it was a date that had already been arranged through eHarmony. And if that's the case, what that may indicate, and I'm just speculating, is that they hadn't been together all that long, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks. When I say together, I mean it had progressed to a intimate sexual relationship. So a couple of days or a week, maybe 2 weeks. In other words, maybe something had started, maybe they'd kissed before San Diego and then something had gone further afterwards. Or maybe it had started even earlier. In other words, a sexual relationship before San Diego. The point is, the relationship was still fairly young enough that Kessinger went to this baseball game supposedly on a date, and then I don't think the date pitched up. So I think she was actually stood up on this outing, and you can kind of imagine the double effect of that. And the double effect is, irrespective kind of the circumstances around it, she's interested in Watts, he's interested in her, but there's a bit of a sort of hovering uncertainty. She goes to a Rockies game, he's aware that he sort of argued with Shan'ann, then argued with her, and it's kind of, and the lesson is kind of like, don't do that again. You do that, and then she will go with someone else to something else, and it'll all be over. So don't argue with her, and make sure you keep things sort of on the down low. Don't argue with Shan'ann either. So the lesson is basically, don't argue. And this probably was quite a significant day for him, July 4th. But for Nicole Kessinger as well, she goes to the baseball game. She may have felt a mixture of sort of wanting to prove a point to him, like, you know, if you don't put me first, I'm going to put someone else first. And then what happens is she goes and the other guy doesn't pitch up. And then she must feel almost in kind of a tiz, in a sort of a maelstrom of, wow, you know, I'm going to have to make this thing work. I really like this guy and there's no one else. You know, I can't really find anyone else. So there may have been a feeling of desperation, mutual desperation, that came out of her going to that Rockies game on July 4th. Now, July 4th would be a day where, if you spend even a little bit of time apart, when you could have spent that time together, you're going to feel that so much more keenly, because it's one of those days where people spend it together, like Thanksgiving. And so drama on that day is going to have a lasting effect, don't you think? Anyway, he goes, in terms of Aberdeen, as I mentioned yesterday, the 4th of July was a washout, but so was the 5th. And the video illustrates that despite their argument on the 4th, Watts spends the night at Kessinger's. So something that I've sort of speculated is, could they have made up with one another before the Rockies game at the Watts home? I think that's possible. On the other hand, they may not have gone that far. Maybe have just kissed one another and sort of soothed one another, and then after the Rockies game, maybe there was sort of a mutual chemistry, but almost born out of almost like desperation. And sometimes people who are really dependent or insecure, they can be very sort of, the sexual fireworks can be quite intense. Obviously it's not going to last, but it is sort of very intense, to almost both people trying to use that as a glue for themselves, maybe for the other person. By 14:24 the next day, which is a Thursday, Shan'ann's on the phone. Watts was likely about to return home from the oil fields when he received the call. So Shan'ann sort of timed this call for like the end of his work day. I'm assuming that he didn't work that day. And they had a 2.5 minute conversation. So he may have said, look, I can't actually talk now. I'll call you when I get home, or something like that. One wonders also what Shan'ann wanted to talk about. Maybe she felt bad about what had been said the previous day, but also sort of noticed that he'd been a little bit quiet the previous night. They'd spoken in the morning, but had they spoken again in the evening, the previous evening? In all, Shan'ann and her husband spoke for a total of almost 23 minutes on July the 5th. The telephone conversations between Watts and his wife are one of the few areas we know virtually nothing about, as I said earlier. Now, we didn't know from the phone data review bit that we did yesterday how they were getting on or what was going on, but from other sources we now know that they were actually arguing. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that, given how this family ended, I suspect that there was quite a lot of arguing on the phone. I think when Kessinger was asked about it, she said something like, Watts always went outside to speak to her. And I'm sure if you were overhearing Watts talking, I don't know if you would know for certain whether they were arguing, because of just the way that he is. He's quite quiet, he wouldn't say much. On the other hand, if they were arguing and he was sort of saying, maybe stuttering and saying, but I, and don't talk to me like that or whatever, if she overheard that, she may have taken satisfaction out of that. She may have thought, well, it's good that they're not getting along, because then he's not sort of two-timing me. I am going to be number one. So there's a strange kind of thing with that. If he speaks to his wife and they're getting along, if he's in her company and he speaks to his wife and it sounds like it's very lovey-dovey, that's not going to be very good for her either, theoretically. It's kind of like a minefield, isn't it? It's possible Shan'ann's brother Frankie or her folks may have caught snippets of these conversations as well, so on the other side, or at least seen her demeanor before or after the calls. What would they have talked about? Was it all small talk? Did they ever hear Shan'ann saying something and then talk about that? And this is the kind of thing that, to me, is missing from the Ruseks. I would really like to know that from them. These are details in the last couple of weeks leading up to the crime that they would have not necessarily paid attention to, but they may have been party to sort of indirectly. They may have seen Shan'ann after she got off the phone. They may have heard the odd comment here and there. Shan'ann may have spoken to them immediately after a phone call and said something. Not on one day, on as much as 35 days, on over about 6 weeks, 6 or 7 weeks. Bear in mind, this is also the period where Shan'ann was in San Diego and Frank Rusek was in Frederick looking after the kids. So I'm just saying, for that longish period, around about 2 months prior to the murders, were things completely happy? I know they looked happy on Facebook, but what did they actually experience? And so the question isn't convince us how happy Shan'ann was and convince us how happy Chris Watts was. Given that a crime happened, given that Chris Watts also murdered his own children, was there any evidence, are there any memories of things that didn't sound very good? Not that anyone is to blame, just were a few comments made that they perhaps should have paid more attention to at the time, given what happened. And why this is quite important is something like that could happen to somebody else, where a husband is starting to tune out, starting to become standoffish, and it's not enough to just say, well, he's not quite as friendly as he usually is. That's a generalization. Specifically, what does one need to look out for? And if you're going to say, well, there's absolutely no clue from Shan'ann, she just seemed completely happy, her Facebook was just wall-to-wall harmony and happiness, then the lesson to learn from this is there's absolutely no way you can tell when someone's about to murder you, someone very, very close to you. And I'm not saying that there is a way to tell always. I'm just saying I'm pretty sure in this case one could tell, because Chris Watts was having an affair. Surely Shan'ann started complaining that he just wasn't around, that she was struggling to get hold of him, that he wasn't calling her back, that he sounded different. Did he never say that? Did she never say that? So that's a kind of narrative that I would be interested in hearing. But so far what we sort of hear is just how perfectly happy they were. But they weren't. We know that they were actually arguing, but did no one hear these arguments? Were these arguments behind locked doors? Were they completely secret? Was someone else keeping those arguments private, those disagreements private? Did they talk much about the children? What were the issues that were spoken about? Would Shan'ann's parents or her brother have any idea? What would have been the small talk day to day? Or was there a regular theme, such as the state of their finances or finding ways to scrimp on money? What did they often talk about? On July 5th, Shan'ann calls her husband twice and he calls her once. At the end of the day, at about 18:37, and presumably Watts was back at work, so he would have seen Kissinger at work, probably returned home either to collect Dieter or, who knows, turn on or off an alarm or I don't know what. It would be interesting to know his schedule as well. If he went home, what did he do when he went home? Was it just to activate the sensors to show that he'd arrived home? Did he eat at home and sleep at Kissinger? Did they have meals together? Just little details like that. In any event, at around about 20 to 7, Watts calls Shan'ann, and they have a 13-minute conversation. So that's quite a long conversation. Obviously, at this point, things have probably improved slightly with Kissinger, and things have probably also improved slightly with Shan'ann. And so Watts is starting to gain traction with his game, with his ability to manipulate both women. Then she calls him back moments later, and they have a nearly 7-minute conversation. So what that suggests is either Shan'ann felt bad after their conversation and wanted to address something, or it was quite a argumentative conversation and they weren't done after 13 minutes. And maybe Watts said, look, I've got to go. Well, where did he need to go? To Kissinger. And then she called him back, and and then they spoke. He might have said to her, look, I need to go, I need to work out or whatever. And that was the way of sort of getting rid of Shan'ann, is to talk about needing to exercise. I analyzed the video of the children and Shan'ann in some detail, and you can actually see Shan'ann still wearing her Thrive patches despite being pregnant in the original video. Now, on the Crime Rocket 2 blog, you can click on a link there that talks about what are some of the contraindications and potential side effects of wearing Thrive patches while pregnant. There's a forum that also discusses it, and one user noted that certain ingredients like ephedrine in the DFT Thrive patches could be linked to heart defects in fetuses. Now, I want to emphasize here, and I know Thrivers, this will be anathema to Thrivers and to the whole MLM crowd. If you have something like Thrive or a shake or anything, and then the doctor says you shouldn't use it while pregnant. Why? Well, because it could cause a birth defect. Then you must know, do you really think that is something that is healthy? If something that you take could cause deformities in an unborn child, do you think that is something that is healthy, or do you think it's potentially toxic or poisonous or something else? Now, if you compare that to something else, should you drink alcohol while pregnant? Now, a lot of people drink alcohol. But if you say, well, you shouldn't really drink alcohol while pregnant, why? Because it's not good for an unborn child. Well, out of the same thing, is it good for a person? Well, it might feel good, but is it technically, is it good for you? I think the answer is pretty obvious, it's not. So I think anything where someone says, don't consume that while you're pregnant, do you really think it's healthy? The more than 5-minute original video, in terms of the Rainstorm, provides an extended view of how Shan'ann interacts with both her children. So what's so interesting about that is we're getting a contextual look and feel for Shan'ann's mood and how she's interacting with the rest of her family in North Carolina. Early on, Shan'ann refers to things coming out of the sky that beat you to death, and she's actually referring to hailstorms when she says that. But it's just sometimes people say things in simple language that is subconsciously connected to something else. And she's referring here to almost an idea of symbolic wrath, right? And what can come out of the sky and beat you to death if you're a child? Well, a parent's hand. What can come out of the sky and beat you to death if you're having an affair? Karma, right? What can come out of the sky and beat you to death if you're in a impending premeditated murder? Your husband's hands. So that's quite an interesting. You might say, well, it's totally irrelevant and it's got nothing to do with anything, but as an author, I certainly find those sort of constructs interesting. And often what I do is I pick some of them out, and then you sort of use, or you're able to have the own words of a person in a particular scenario, so you're not projecting your own or transferring your own ideas or your own vocabulary into someone else's life. And it's interesting that she refers to it as beating you to death. It's quite a violent sort of thing, isn't it? I'm not saying that that's related to anything. I'm just saying that's something that occurs to her at the time. And obviously she's being a little bit tongue-in-cheek. You know, that you get brief storms in Colorado, and in Aberdeen obviously you kind of have extended showers, maybe gentler and going on for longer. So a question I posed on the Crime Rocket 2 post dealing with this particular day was, did Watts watch this particular video? Did Watts look at the video of his children and his wife and his parents-in-law? Because at about 4 minutes remaining in the video, Shan'ann tells her children, "Daddy's on here watching you." What was he thinking on July 5th, watching them from Colorado? Now bear in mind what had just happened the day before. He'd argued with Shan'ann, and he'd argued with Kissinger, and Kissinger was saying, "Put me first." But what was he thinking when he was watching that? Thank you for listening. I hope wherever you are in the world, you're safe and well, getting enough sleep. I'm certainly struggling to get enough sleep, but for kind of different reasons. Later today, I'll be putting up a video on Van Gogh, and on Patreon, I will be reviewing the next section in the Dateline documentary dealing with Laurie Vallow, so look out for that. Once again, I just want to thank the people who've subscribed recently. I think by about the time this video goes up, or shortly after, I hope to reach 13,000 subscribers. I'm not actively trying to get subscribers, but I certainly am not complaining if I get them. I just mean I'm not following all the high-profile cases and news as much as I should. I just have quite a few things on the ball, so I appreciate people subscribing, and I do think what I provide is a little bit different in terms of these longer narratives on YouTube that flow on from one another, almost like a soapy, I guess, except this is real life, real people, real crime, and unfortunately real tragedy. Real people lost their lives in this, and 2 years later we're still finding out new things. And it's actually amazing how much you can find out if you just pay attention, if you just keep knocking on the door and looking for information. And so whenever I see people saying we'll never know, it really agitates me, because we can know almost everything if we pay attention for long enough, if we pay attention carefully enough. And that's what True Crime Rocket Science is all about. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.